welcome to our C12 office hour. This is session number 3, and I'm Charlene Robles, and you can see we have other DaSy TA partners, Ann Lucas, Ginger Elliott Teague, Sharissa Blanchard, Charlene Wooten, and our administrative support is Gabby Hall. And we can go to the next slide. So our agenda for today is focusing on the subsequent correction, reporting, and describing the data for Indicator C12. And then we'll also have some example language for you. We'll spend the time after that looking at talking about questions and discussions, and then sharing resources. And one thing I meant to say earlier was that we are recording these office hours, and Anne has just dropped the link in the chat if you want to see the recordings for the previous 2 office hours. And you may want to just drop your question during the content presentation in the chat, and Shailen will take care of them for you. He'll read it out loud and we'll respond if you do have questions during the content period. All right, and then we can go to the next slide. So we do have a poll for you. We're interested, of course, this is subsequent correction, so we're interested to know if, do you have any uncorrected findings for C12 that need to be reported in this year's APR, whether they're subsequently corrected or not. So if you could just take a moment and respond. All right, thanks. So we see that at least almost half of you have a subsequent correction that either that would need to be reported, and the other half are not sure or no. All right, thank you. We can go to the next slide, and I think I'm turning this over now to Ginger and Anne to take us through.
Thank you, Charlene. So we're going to, like we have in the prior 2 office hours, we're going to talk through some content first, go through the data tables to just give you a refresher on what needs to be included in the various tables, and then talk through some of the narrative requirements as well. And we do have some example language to share with you. And after this first section, there is a new section in Indicator 12 to be reported. So we want to bring that up to you and make sure you're aware of that too. Okay, so we're first going to talk about what was in last year's APR as well as this year's. And this is the summary of findings issued in the just prior federal fiscal year. Okay, so in this current template, it asks you to summarize the number of findings of noncompliance that your state identified in FFY 2023 that were corrected or not in FFY 2024. Okay, so corrected within that 1 year as required. Of course, as we've talked about before, correction requires 2 components, right? At the child record level and then systemic compliance. So in this table, we have some example data. It will, and this is on page 53 in the template. If you have that template available and you don't have anything else in it yet, it is on page 53. So this table asks for the number of findings that you identified in, that should say 2023, FFY 2023. And that would be 24. The purple cells, all 3 of the cells in this table are auto-calculated based on the findings across all your other tables, okay? So it sums up the number of findings that were identified. And so there were 24. And then it sums up the number that were timely corrected within 1 year. And then it will give you the number of findings that you reported as not verified as corrected within 1 year. So in our example, of course, that's 4. So this table, you will not have to fill anything out. However, double check the numbers here, because this will, the information here will carry over to next year. So if you have subsequent correction, or correction that wasn't done within, that following year. So just make sure that these numbers are correct, because you will have to respond to them. So that's your summary data. Then on the next slide is the subsequent correction table. So this is the summary of all outstanding findings of noncompliance identified in FFY 2023 that were not timely corrected in 2024. Okay. So those 4 up at the top in row 4 pull over from that prior table. So it calculates in that other table that we looked at on the just prior slide, it calculated 4 that were not timely corrected with 1 year. It pulls that 4 over into this table. And then it will pull over the next box too, the number of written findings of noncompliance the state had verified has corrected beyond the 1 year timeline. Okay, so that will pull over. And then you have to fill out the rest manually. So we'll ask you, so 5 is your indicators 1, 7, 8A, 8B, and 8C data that you have previously reported as being corrected beyond the 1 year timeline. And then the 6A, 6B, 6C, all of those boxes, and box 7, you will have to manually enter. And those are based on your related requirements. Any findings based on related requirements that were subsequently corrected or not after that first year, okay? So the first box is the total not timely corrected. The second box, row 5, is the number that you reported as being verified as corrected subsequently, okay? And this should be, we're slightly unclear on where this is pulling from, but I believe this is going to pull from your indicator data and should sum up from those. So just be aware that some of these things that are being auto-populated, once the template is, or once the system is available, we'll be able to see more clearly where everything's pulling from. But we do know that those rows that are 6 and 7, you will have to manually update, okay? So if your total at the top is 4, you should make sure that the sum of all of those rows 5 through 7 is also 4. So just verify your data as you're working through these tables. Okay, now I'm going to pass it to Anne.
Thank you, Ginger. So let's go to the next slide. So in the description of subsequent correction and thinking about that example that Ginger just showed, that there's several items that were subsequently corrected, what you're going to need to describe is the nature of any continuing noncompliance, any actions that have been taken or will be taken to ensure subsequent correction, and then any sanctions or enforcement actions that you're using or have used to help ensure the correction. And I do want to point out that the language here talks about IDEA enforcement provisions, so they should be in line with that. And then OMB uniform administrative requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements for federal awards, which is uniform guidance, and then any state rules. So keep that in mind as you're doing it. And let's go to the next slide, and we'll talk about a few tips across each of these 3 items. So when you think about the nature of the noncompliance, you might be thinking about well, how extensive is it? Is it only happening with one service coordinator, or is it happening more consistently across all service coordinators? Or like if we think about the timely services requirement indicator 1 that had an outstanding finding in Ginger's example, it would be how many providers is this impacting? And so think about that. You may also want to think about how many kids it's impacting, how many instances is it occurring in. If it's only a few, but with several service coordinators, that might be one thing. But if it's a lot of kids with only several service coordinators, then that will be helpful information, because one of the things as you think about the nature of the noncompliance, you should be thinking about, well, what's the underlying reason behind why we have the noncompliance? And that might be thinking about root cause analysis. And so if it's happening with a lot of kids, but only with a few service coordinators, maybe that's related to the fact that these 2 service coordinators are new and they really did not understand the requirement. It could have impact on maybe your policies and procedures related to this aren't clear. Or it could be that they don't have any means of tracking the timelines related to actual services and the provision of services. So thinking through that as part of the nature of the noncompliance, and also it'll be important to identify and think about what the source of that noncompliance was. How did you identify it? Could be through a complaint, it could be through cyclical monitoring, and of course the fiscal year in which the finding was issued. So let's go to the next slide, and we'll talk very briefly about what things you might think about in describing actions taken. These are examples of actions that we know that some states have actually taken to ensure subsequent correction, and might include actually increasing the frequency of reporting correction data, if that's part of their role, to report it to you. It could be the state partnering with the program or provider to conduct an in-depth root cause analysis to identify what's really contributing to the uncorrected noncompliance and developing a clear plan of action. And it could end up meaning that the state might actually direct the program or provider in what actual actions they would need to take to address those root causes of the noncompliance. Also, we know that states have also met monthly with the program or provider to review the progress in that this program is making with their correction data, or the activities that they're doing to make sure that they're making progress on both ends. So let's go on to the next slide, and we'll talk just very briefly about sanctions and enforcement actions. So again, these are just examples. These are things that you might do, and they would, again, have to align with IDEA requirements as well as uniform guidance. And you could do things like requiring TA, directing how they use funds, imposing conditions on the contract if things don't progress and correction occur. And then kind of the last 2 points on the slide are things that are kind of further down the line. If the things that you're working on with them aren't working, there could be an actual discontinuation of the contract or a withholding of funds. And let's go to the next slide, and I think we'll share an example So I'm going to go off of the fact that there's still one finding that was not subsequently corrected. And that particular finding was issued to the program in federal fiscal year 2023 as a result of cyclical monitoring. It's systemic in nature due to several factors. Providers are not offering makeup services when a program provider reason for a missing appointment occurs, or they're not having good documentation when a service is missed, if it's due to a parent or program or provider reason. So it's unknown what the cause of the delay is. So that's part of it. And let's go on to the next slide and we'll look at the rest of this. And then the required actions based upon this particular scenario is that the state has provided training to program staff on the state's missed appointment policy and documentation requirements related to reasons for missed appointments, that they've required the program to revise their internal policies and procedures to align with these state requirements and expectations for missed appointments. And they've also required the program to establish an internal process of monitoring or providing oversight of the implementation of their internal policies related to these expectations. So let's go on to the next slide. And then as a final wrap up of this section, as far as sanctions, the state required the EI program to meet monthly with them to access TA. So they're requiring access of TA, and for the state to provide oversight of the progress. And the monthly meetings are scheduled to continue until the program completes all required action and the program achieves subsequent correction. So that's a scenario that we've provided there, give you a clue on how those three parts fit together in a story. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Ginger.
Thanks, Anne. So as we mentioned, there is a new box and section in Indicator 12. And this section asks you to report on the correction of outstanding findings that were identified in prior years. And so this also is on page 53. It follows that section that Anne just described, that paragraph of describing how the state has addressed the subsequent correction and non-correction of findings. So this box will also autofill. So what we understand right now is that it will pull in the year, the FFY 2022. We are not sure if it's going to pull in prior years, but we don't think so. We think it will start with FFY 2022, since that was the data that was in Indicator 12 last year in your subsequent correction table. So we don't know that it's going to pull in prior years before that, like FFY 2021, but we will find out. So FFY 2022, you will have a row for that if you had any findings of correction of noncompliance that were not subsequently verified as corrected. So in this example, there were 8 findings that were still not yet verified as of your last APR. Since then, 6 have been verified as corrected. Okay, so in that year, 6 of those 8 were corrected, and there are still 2 that remain open from FFY 2022. So remember, your subsequent correction box looks at the findings that were not yet corrected or were corrected in FFY 2023. And this box looks at those prior years. Okay, so those blue boxes will pre-populate. The purple is a calculation. And so it should be pretty straightforward. I would recommend that you check the numbers in these boxes, that they align with what you had in prior years, what you submitted last year, what you understand to be corrected this year. Of course, that white box there is what you will be hand entering, manually entering. So just make sure your numbers are correct. If something seems, and this is true for the whole APR, but if something seems like it's not calculating correctly, reach out to the Partner Support Center, because they will make a ticket for that and will double check that things are working correctly in the system. So at any time, if you see something not working correctly, or you suspect something might not be working correctly with the calculations, of course, reach out to them and ask that they investigate. Okay. So with that, I'll pass it back to Anne.
Thank you, Ginger. So for the narrative that goes along with this new box related to those findings that still have not yet been corrected or subsequently corrected, what OSIP is going to be looking for is how the state, a description of how the state verified that the source of the noncompliance, whether it's a program, a single point of entry, a provider, whomever, that source is now correctly implementing the regulatory requirement, and that's based on a review of updated data. And then the second piece is providing a description on how the state verified that each individual case of noncompliance was corrected. And then for any findings that are still not yet verified as corrected, what those actions are that have been taken if it was not corrected. Now, I want to stop here and say this all probably sounds extremely familiar to what we talked about on our last session too. It's basically the same information, yet you're writing this about those findings that you verified as subsequently corrected, and then the actions taken for those that still have not yet been corrected. So let's go to the next slide, and I have a couple points that I want to point out. What we're encouraging you to do, instead of redoing part of the presentation from last time, we are encouraging you, particularly if you missed last call, to go back and actually review the slides and the recording from our session 2 that helps provide tips and examples of how to describe that you have verified correction of both this at the systemic level, meaning the program or provider is at 100% compliance and implementing the requirement as expected, and that each individual child correction has occurred. And so we included in the slides last time example from Hawaii, who graciously shared their description with us. So we're encouraging you to go back and look at those tips and also look at the sample from Hawaii rather than going through it all again today. One thing I do want to make note of that we can't say enough, and this is where I believe a lot of states were cited this past year for how they described how they verified the correction of noncompliance for both the systems level and the child level correction. You have to put your description in past tense, and it needs to be what you describe and what you did specifically related to correcting each finding. And it's not a general description of how you do it for any finding, but for those findings. So indicator 1 findings, you would be talking about how you did it for indicator 1, what data source you used, and all of those pieces that fit together with it, and how much data you pulled, and when you did it. So keep that in mind and make sure that it's not just this general description. And that's where I think as I've looked at a number of states' responses from OSAP, that's been the key, was the wording and how it was worded. So with that, I think I'm turning it over to Sharisa for our Q&A.